The letter arrived on a Tuesday morning, carried by a dust-covered rider who barely stayed long enough to water his horse. Margaret Maggie Sullivan stood in the doorway of her cramped boarding house room in Independence, Missouri, turning the envelope over in her weathered hands. The paper was coarse, the handwriting angular and unpracticed. "Dear Mrs. Sullivan," it began. "I am writing in response to your advertisement in the Matrimonial News. My name is Thomas Barrett. I own land in the Arizona Territory, near the Gila River. I seek a wife of good character who can endure the hardships of frontier life. I am an honest man, though I must confess I am not one for many words. If you are willing, I will send passage money for your journey west. I await your reply. Respectfully, T. Barrett." Maggie read it 3 times before folding it carefully. Her fingers trembled slightly as she tucked it into her apron pocket. Through the thin walls, she could hear Mrs. Henderson berating her husband again, the sound of breaking crockery punctuating their argument. The boarding house reeked of cabbage and despair. Housing war widows like herself, who scraped by on washing and mending for the few coins it brought. She moved to the window, gazing out at the muddy streets of Independence. 3 years had passed since Antietam took her husband James, leaving her with nothing but his uniform and a letter from his captain praising his bravery. The war had taken more than just her husband. It had stolen pieces of her soul she'd never speak of, memories that haunted her sleep and made her flinch at unexpected touches. The decision came easier than she expected. What was left for her here? The pitying looks from proper ladies who crossed the street when they saw her threadbare dress. The knowing leers from men who assumed a widow without means had other ways to pay her rent. Within a week, she'd sold her few possessions: James's pocket watch, her mother's pearl hairpins, the quilt her sister had made for her wedding. The money, combined with what Mr. Barrett sent, was just enough for a third-class ticket on the Atchison, Topeka and Santa Fe Railway. The morning of her departure, Maggie packed her life into a single carpet bag, 2 calico dresses, a wool shawl, undergarments mended so many times the original fabric was barely visible, her Bible with pressed flowers from James's grave tucked between the pages, and a small daguerreotype of her parents. Everything else, the furniture, the dishes, the remnants of her former life, had been sold or given away. At the station, she joined a handful of other passengers waiting for the westbound train. A family with 3 young children huddled together, the mother's eyes holding the same desperate hope Maggie felt. 2 rough-looking men in trail-worn clothes spoke in low voices about silver strikes and claim jumpers. A salesman clutched his sample case like a lifeline. The train arrived in a cloud of black smoke and screaming metal. Maggie found a seat by the window, her carpetbag clutched in her lap. As the whistle blew and the train lurched forward, she didn't look back at Independence. There was nothing there worth seeing anymore. The journey west stripped away the last vestiges of civilization layer by layer. Through Kansas, the endless grasslands stretched to the horizon, broken only by the occasional homestead with its sad little garden fighting against the prairie wind. She watched buffalo bones scattered like broken promises alongside the tracks, bleached white by the unforgiving sun. In Colorado, the mountains rose like God's own walls, massive and indifferent. The train climbed through passes so narrow she could reach out and touch the rock face, while on the other side, the ground fell away into dizzying depths. At night, she heard wolves howling in the distance, their calls echoing off the canyon walls. The sound made her pull her shawl tighter, remembering stories of settlers who'd vanished without a trace. The other passengers thinned out at each stop. The family disembarked in Dodge City, the mother clutching her children as they stepped into the dusty chaos. One of the rough men got off in Pueblo, presumably to lose himself in the mining camps. By the time they crossed into New Mexico territory, Maggie often found herself alone in the car, with only the rhythmic clacking of the rails for company. The landscape became increasingly alien. Red rocks jutting from the earth like ancient bones, sparse vegetation clinging to life in the shadows of mesas. Dust devils danced across the flatlands, and the sky stretched impossibly wide and blue, unmarred by the factory smoke of eastern cities. At night, more stars than she'd ever imagined possible blazed overhead, making her feel infinitely small. The train's final stop in the Arizona Territory was barely more than a collection of wooden buildings huddled around the depot. Benson, the conductor announced, though it looked more like an afterthought than a town. Maggie stepped onto the platform, the heat hitting her like a physical blow despite the late afternoon hour. The air was so dry it made her throat ache. She stood there, carpetbag in hand, watching the train disappear into the shimmering distance. Around her, the few other passengers dispersed quickly, claimed by waiting relatives or heading purposefully toward the town's single hotel. Soon, she was alone on the platform with only a mangy dog for company. That's when she saw him. He stood in the shadow of the depot building, so still she almost missed him. Tall and lean, with skin burnished by the sun to a deep copper. His hair was black as midnight, worn longer than any white man would dare, held back by a leather cord. He wore a mix of clothing, canvas pants like any frontiersman, but with a vest decorated with intricate beadwork, and moccasins instead of boots. Maggie's breath caught. This was not Thomas Barrett. This was an Apache warrior, or something close to it. Every newspaper account she'd read, every whispered story of raids and massacres, suddenly flooded her mind. Her hand instinctively went to her throat. He moved then, stepping into the fading sunlight with a grace that made no sound. His face was angular, sharp-featured, with eyes so dark they seemed to hold depth she couldn't fathom. When he spoke, his voice was low and careful, each word precisely chosen. Mrs. Sullivan? The sound of her name in his mouth, her married name, the name from the letter, made the situation suddenly, impossibly real. She nodded, unable to form words. I am the one who wrote, "My American name is Thomas Barrett." He paused, something flickering in his expression. "My true name is Dakota. I apologize for the deception." Maggie stood frozen, her mind racing. She'd traveled over 1,000 miles to marry a stranger, selling everything she owned for the chance at a new life. But this was beyond anything she'd imagined. The careful penmanship of the letter, the formal words, had painted a picture of a perhaps rough but recognizable frontier farmer. Not this man who looked like he'd stepped from the very landscape itself, dangerous and unknown. I don't understand," she finally managed. "The land I spoke of is real. The need for a wife is real." His eyes never left hers, steady and unblinking. "But no white woman would come if she knew the truth. So I used the name given to me at the mission school." The platform suddenly felt too exposed. Maggie was aware of eyes watching from windows, of curtains twitching in the buildings along the street, a woman alone with an Apache man. The scandal of it pressed against her like a physical weight. She had two choices: get back on the next eastbound train with the last of her money, return to the grinding poverty and whispered shame of independence, or follow this stranger into the unknown. Neither option promised safety. Neither offered the life she'd dreamed of as a young bride, before the war tore everything apart. Dakota seemed to sense her turmoil. "I will not force you. If you wish to return, I will pay for your passage." He gestured toward a wagon waiting at the edge of the platform, loaded with supplies. "If you come with me, I promise you will be treated with respect. I am not what the newspapers say we are." In the distance, a coyote howled, the sound lonely and wild. The sun was sinking toward the horizon, painting the desert in shades of blood and gold. Maggie thought of her empty room in Independence, of the factory work that would slowly kill her spirit, of the men who would see her as easy prey. She straightened her spine, lifting her chin with the same resolve that had carried her through the war years. "I've come this far," she said quietly. "I'll see it through." Something shifted in his expression, surprise, perhaps, or respect. He reached for her carpetbag, careful not to touch her directly. "The journey to my land is 2 days. We will stop tonight at Sulphur Springs." As she followed him to the wagon, Maggie caught her reflection in the depot window, a pale woman in a travel-stained dress, walking into the desert with an Apache man. She looked like a ghost already. She thought, perhaps that's what she was, the ghost of Margaret Sullivan, war widow, following a stranger into a landscape that might swallow her whole. The wagon seat was hard beneath her, the springs creaking as Dakota clicked to the horses as they left Benson behind, heading into the vast expanse of the Sonoran Desert. Maggie clutched her Bible and wondered if she was being delivered or damned. The red dust rose around them like a veil, obscuring the last glimpse of civilization, carrying her toward a fate she could never have imagined when she'd answered that advertisement with trembling hands and desperate hope. The cabin sat against a ridge of red rock, more part of the landscape than separate from it, built from adobe and rough-hewn timber. It seemed to have grown from the earth itself. A small corral held 3 horses, and beyond that, a garden plot struggled against the desert soil. Smoke drifted from a stone chimney, the only sign of human habitation in the vast emptiness. Maggie stood beside the wagon, her legs unsteady after 2 days of bone-jarring travel. The journey had been mostly silent, with Dakota speaking only when necessary, to point out a water source, to warn of a rattlesnake, to indicate where they would camp. She'd slept under stars so bright they hurt to look at, wrapped in a blanket that smelled of sage and smoke. "This is home," Dakota said simply, beginning to unload supplies. Home. The word sat strangely in her mind as she surveyed the rough dwelling. No white curtains at the windows, no picket fence, no neighbors within a day's ride. Just this solitary structure beneath an endless sky, surrounded by saguaro cacti standing like silent sentinels. Inside, the cabin was sparse but clean. A stone fireplace dominated one wall, with cooking implements hanging nearby. A rough-hewn table and 2 chairs occupied the center of the main room. Through a doorway, she glimpsed a smaller room with a narrow bed. Everything was functional, without ornament except for a few pieces of pottery decorated with geometric designs. "You will sleep there." Dakota indicated the bedroom. "I will sleep here." He gestured to a bedroll near the fireplace. The arrangement was clear. Marriage in name, but not in fact. Not yet. Perhaps not ever. Maggie felt both relief and an odd disappointment she didn't care to examine. Days fell into a rhythm. Dawn came early in the desert, painting the rocks in shades of rose and gold. Maggie would rise, dress quickly in the cold morning air, and begin the day's work. There was always work, drawing water from the well, tending the struggling garden, mending clothes, preparing meals from the supplies Dakota brought from town. He was gone often during the day, tending to his horses, hunting, or working on repairs to the cabin and outbuildings. When he was present, he moved like a shadow, making barely a sound. Sometimes she would look up from her work to find him watching her with those dark, unreadable eyes, only to have him turn away when their gazes met. The silence between them was vast as the desert itself. Not hostile, exactly, but careful, like 2 wild animals sharing territory, wary of sudden movements. Maggie threw herself into the work, grateful for the distraction. The garden became her particular project. The soil was sandy and alkaline, nothing like the rich black earth of Missouri. But she persisted, hauling water bucket by bucket, working compost into the ground, coaxing life from seeds that seemed determined to die. One afternoon, as she struggled with a particularly stubborn weed, she sensed Dakota behind her. Without a word, he knelt beside her, his hands working the soil with a knowledge her fumbling efforts lacked. He showed her how to build small berms to catch the infrequent rain, how to identify which native plants would shelter her vegetables from the brutal sun. "The desert gives life," he said, his longest speech in days, but only to those who understand its ways. That night, she found a bundle of herbs on the table, desert marigold for her cough that had persisted since the dusty journey, and something else she didn't recognize. "For your hands," he said, indicating the blisters from her work. "Steep in hot water, then wrap." The gesture was small, but it cracked something open between them. Maggie began to notice other things, how he always ensured the water bucket was full before she woke, how fresh game appeared when their supplies ran low, how he'd reinforced the chicken coop after she'd mentioned worrying about coyotes. 3 weeks into her new life, Maggie ventured to town with Dakota for supplies. The journey that had seemed endless on her arrival now felt almost manageable. As they approached Benson, her stomach tightened. She was no longer the anonymous widow stepping off the train, but the white woman who'd married an Apache. The reception was worse than she'd imagined. Conversations died as they entered the general store. Women pulled their children closer. Men's hands drifted to their weapons. The proprietor, a thin man with cold eyes, served them with barely concealed disgust, overcharging blatantly. "We don't want no trouble here," he said, though Dakota had done nothing but quietly request flour and salt. Outside, loading their purchases, Maggie heard the whispers. "Shameless. Know what them savages do to white women? Ought to be a law." Her face burned, but she kept her head high as Dakota helped her onto the wagon seat. Only when they were well outside town did she allow her shoulders to slump. "I'm sorry," she said quietly. Dakota glanced at her. "For what?" For bringing you trouble. They might have served you without such hostility if you'd come alone." Something shifted in his expression. "They would have refused to serve me at all if I came alone. Your presence, even disapproved of, makes them careful. They fear what attacking me might bring upon you." The truth of it sat heavy between them. She was his protection as much as he was hers, in this strange dance of prejudice and frontier politics. That evening, as she prepared a simple meal of beans and cornbread, Dakota spoke unprompted for the first time. "I was taken to the mission school when I was 7, he said, staring into the fire. "They cut my hair, burned my clothes, beat me for speaking my language. Thomas Barrett, that was the name they gave me, after the missionary who founded the place." Maggie's hands stilled in their work. She understood. Suddenly, the careful penmanship of his letter, the formal English that marked someone who'd learned it through pain. "For 10 years, they tried to kill the Apache in me, make me white." His smile was bitter. "When I left, I belonged nowhere. Too white for my people, too Apache for yours. Is that why you—" She hesitated, then forged ahead. "Why you advertised for a wife? A white man told me once that land ownership meant nothing without inheritance, without children to pass it to." He met her eyes directly. "I thought perhaps, but it was foolish. I see now what I have asked of you." Maggie served the meal in silence, her mind churning. After they ate, she surprised herself by speaking. "My husband was a good man, kind, gentle. He died at Antietam, they said, though they never found his body." She traced patterns on the rough table. "But before that, when I worked as a nurse, there was an officer. He took what he wanted, several times. The other nurses knew, but what could anyone do? He was a major, from a good family." The words came haltingly, pieces of shame she'd never spoken aloud. "When I realized I was with child, I tried to hide it, but the fever came, and the baby. She was born too early, too small. She lived 3 days." Dakota's stillness was complete, but somehow not cold. It was the stillness of deep attention, of witness. "They discharged me, of course. Unmarried women who found themselves in such circumstances weren't fit to tend wounded soldiers." The bitterness in her own voice surprised her. "When James came home on leave and proposed, I told him everything. He married me anyway, said it didn't matter, that he'd love me regardless. 2 months later, he was dead." She raised her eyes to find Dakota watching her with something she couldn't name, not pity, which she would have hated, but a kind of recognition. "So you see," she finished quietly, "I too belong nowhere, too damaged for respectable society, too proud for the alternatives available to women like me." They sat in silence as darkness gathered outside. Finally, Dakota rose and added wood to the fire. "Perhaps," he said slowly, "that is why the desert accepts us. It cares nothing for what others name us. only for what we are willing to endure. That night, Maggie lay in her narrow bed, listening to the foreign sounds of the desert, the yip of coyotes, the whisper of wind through rock, the cry of an owl. For the first time since arriving, she didn't feel quite so alone. The days that followed were different. The silence between them became companionable rather than strained. Dakota began teaching her things: how to identify edible plants, how to read weather signs in the sky, how to move quietly enough not to startle the deer that sometimes came to drink at the stream below the ridge. Maggie, in turn, shared her knowledge of herbs and healing, learned during her time as a nurse. She showed him how her mother had taught her to make poultices, how to brew teas that eased pain or brought sleep. He watched with interest, occasionally offering his own additions from Apache medicine. One scorching afternoon, as she worked to save her struggling tomato plants from the sun, she felt the suspicious eyes of the townspeople on her still. But here, in this rough cabin with its view of endless desert, those judgments seemed as distant as another life. What did it matter what they thought? She had work to do, a garden to tend, a strange new life to build. She didn't yet know what she and Dakota were to each other, certainly not husband and wife in any conventional sense. Perhaps they were simply two damaged souls who'd found a quiet space to heal, or at least to rest. But as she watched him working with the horses in the corral, his movements full of that peculiar grace, she thought perhaps that was enough. For now. The storm came without warning, as desert storms often do. One moment the sky was clear, the next, black clouds rolled over the mountains like an advancing army. Lightning split the sky, and thunder shook the cabin walls. Rain fell in sheets, turning the dry earth to mud within minutes. Maggie rushed to close the shutters as wind howled through the gaps. The temperature dropped 20 degrees in as many minutes. She'd been caught outside, tending the chickens, and was soaked through by the time she made it inside. Dakota was already there, having secured the horses. He took one look at her shivering form and moved to stoke the fire higher. "Change into dry clothes," he said. "Desert rain can bring sickness." She retreated to her room, peeling off the wet garments with numb fingers. Through the thin wall, she heard him moving about, the clink of metal against stone. When she emerged, wrapped in her warmest shawl, he'd prepared coffee, strong and bitter, with a touch of something that burned pleasantly in her throat. "Apache medicine," he said at her questioning look. "It warms from within." They sat before the fire as the storm raged outside. The silence between them had evolved over the months from awkward to comfortable. But tonight it felt charged, like the electricity in the air. Perhaps it was the whiskey-laced coffee, or the way the firelight played across his features. But Maggie found herself studying him openly for the first time. "Your sister," she said suddenly. "Will you tell me about her?" Dakota's hand stilled around his cup. For a long moment, she thought he wouldn't answer. Then, quietly, he began to speak. Her name was Ayanna. It means eternal bloom. She was 4 years younger than me, born after I'd already been taken to the mission school. I only saw her during the few times I managed to escape and find my people. His voice carried a weight of old grief. She was beautiful, full of laughter. Even when the soldiers came, even when our people were forced onto the reservation, she could find joy in small things. A butterfly, a perfect stone, the way light fell through cottonwood leaves. Maggie watched his face transform with memory, seeing for the first time the boy he must have been. When I was 17, I left the school for good, found what remained of our band. My mother was dead, my father broken by whiskey. But Ayanna, she remembered me, called me brother like no time had passed. He paused, swallowing hard. I tried to protect her. Failed. "What happened?" Maggie asked softly, though she could guess. "Soldiers, not from the fort. Deserters, looking for Apache women to—" He stopped, jaw clenching. "I was hunting, gone 2 days. When I returned, I found her by the stream. What they'd done." His voice broke entirely. Maggie reached across the space between them, her hand covering his. He didn't pull away. "I tracked them. 3 men, Found them camped near Skeleton Canyon, drunk on mezcal they'd stolen. His eyes were black stones in the firelight. I killed them, all three. Felt nothing but cold satisfaction as I did it. They deserved it, Maggie said fiercely. Perhaps, but it changed nothing. Ayanna was still gone, and I became what they said we were, a savage, a killer. He turned his hand palm up, interlacing his fingers with hers. I fled here, to this land I'd bought with money saved from working white men's ranches. Built this cabin, lived alone, until you wrote that letter, Maggie finished. I don't know what I thought, that a wife would make me more than what I'd become, that children might wash the blood from my hands. He laughed bitterly. Foolish dreams. Maggie felt tears on her cheeks, though she hadn't realized she was crying. We're all trying to wash away blood, she whispered. Mine just happens to be my own. She told him then what she'd never told anyone, not even James, about the nights in the field hospital when the major would come. The pain, the helplessness, the way she'd learned to leave her body, to float somewhere near the ceiling while he took what he wanted. About the baby, perfect and tiny, who'd lived just long enough for Maggie to memorize her face. I named her Rose, she said. Buried her in an unmarked grave behind the hospital. Couldn't even visit before they sent me away. Dakota's thumb traced circles on her palm. What was the major's name? Pemberton. Major Charles Pemberton of the Maryland Pembertons. The name tasted like ash. Probably a senator by now. Or a judge. Men like him always prosper. Men like him sometimes disappear, Dakota said quietly. The desert is vast. Many things are lost in it. Maggie looked at him sharply. I'm not asking. I know. But the thought brings you comfort, she considered. Yes, though it shames me to say so. There is no shame in wanting justice, only in the world that denies it. The storm had settled into a steady rain. Thunder rumbled distantly now, moving east across the desert. The fire crackled between them, casting dancing shadows on the walls. Maggie became acutely aware of their joined hands, of the warmth spreading up her arm. I should go to bed, she said, but didn't move. Yes, he agreed, equally still. Later, she would blame the storm, or the whiskey in the coffee, or the raw honesty of their shared confessions. But in that moment, it seemed the most natural thing in the world to lean forward, to meet him in the space between their chairs. The kiss was tentative at first, a question more than a statement. His lips were softer than she'd expected, gentle despite the hardness of his life. When she didn't pull away, he freed his hand from hers to cup her face, thumb brushing away the last traces of her tears. She'd been kissed before, by James, sweet and respectful, and by Pemberton, brutal and taking. This was neither. This was hunger tempered by patience, desire mixed with something that might have been reverence. When they finally parted, both were breathing unsteadily. Maggie, he said, and it was the first time he'd used her given name. She stood abruptly, heart racing. We shouldn't. The words tumbled over each other. He rose as well, but didn't pursue her. I'm sorry if No. She pressed a hand to her lips, still feeling the burn. Don't apologize. I need to think. She fled to her room, closing the door with trembling hands. Through the wood. She heard him bank the fire, heard his footsteps moving to his bedroll, then silence except for the rain. Maggie sat on her narrow bed, mind spinning. What had she done? What were they doing? This wasn't what she'd come west for, not this complicated tangle of desire and damage. Apache and white, past and present. But as she lay down fully clothed, still smelling sage and wood smoke from where he'd touched her, she admitted the truth. She'd been dead inside since that field hospital, going through motions of living without feeling. James had been kind, but she'd never felt more than gratitude for him. The years since his death had been gray fog. Tonight, for the first time in forever, she felt alive, terrified, confused, but alive. The rain continued through the night. She dozed fitfully, starting awake at every sound, half expecting to find him at her door, but Dakota honored the boundary of that closed door, as she'd known he would. Dawn came pale and washed clean. Maggie rose, changed into dry clothes, and tried to armor herself in normalcy. But when she emerged to find Dakota already gone, fled to the horses or the hills to give her space, she felt oddly bereft. She made breakfast, tended her sodden garden, threw herself into a dozen tasks. But her traitorous mind kept returning to those moments by the fire, the weight of his hand, the taste of coffee and whiskey on his lips, the way he'd said her name like a prayer. When he returned at midday, they moved around each other carefully, excessively polite. He brought news that the storm had washed out part of the road to town. They were cut off for at least a week until it dried. "I have enough supplies," Maggie said, not meeting his eyes. "Good. That's good." The day stretched endlessly. Every accidental brush of hands as they worked sent lightning through her. Every glance caught and held a moment too long made her breath catch. The very air between them seemed to hum with possibility and danger. That night, she lasted until full dark before admitting defeat. She found him sitting outside despite the chill, watching stars emerge between scattering clouds. "I can't stop thinking about it," she said simply. He turned to look at her, his face unreadable in the darkness. "Nor I. What are we doing? Dakota, what is this?" "I don't know." He shifted, making space for her on the bench he'd built against the cabin wall. "Perhaps we are two broken people trying to remember what it means to be whole." She sat beside him, close enough to feel his warmth. Or perhaps we're breaking each other worse. Perhaps. He was quiet for a long moment. "Are you afraid? Terrified?" she admitted. "Of me?" "No, never of you." She surprised herself with the truth of it. "Of myself, of what I want, of how much I want it." He turned to face her fully then. In the starlight, she could just make out his features. "In my culture, some things are not spoken of directly. They are danced around, approached sideways, allowed to unfold as the spirit's will." He touched her face with impossible gentleness. "But you are not Apache, so I will speak plainly. I want you, Maggie Sullivan, not as a mail-order bride, not as a solution to my solitude. I want you as you are, damaged and fierce and brave, but I will not take what is not freely given, not ever." The promise in his words undid her last defenses. She caught his hand, pressed it harder against her cheek. "I know, that's why I'm here." This time, when they kissed, there was no hesitation, only hunger finally acknowledged, need finally admitted. When he pulled her closer, she went willingly, her hands finding the long silk of his hair, freed from its leather binding. Here in the darkness, with stars as witness and the desert holding its breath around them, they crossed a line that couldn't be uncrossed, and Maggie found, to her wonder, that she didn't want to go back. The morning after came too bright, too real. Maggie woke in her narrow bed alone, the events of the night before feeling like a dream, except for the slight tenderness of her lips, the lingering scent of sage on her skin. She lay still, listening to the sounds of morning. Birds calling, horses nickering, the scrape of metal that meant Dakota was already working. Shame crashed over her in waves. What had she done? She'd spent the night in his arms, beneath the stars, allowing intimacies she'd only ever shared within marriage. The memory of his hands, gentle but sure, made her face burn. They'd maintained enough restraint not to fully consummate their union, but the lines they'd crossed were clear enough. She couldn't face him. Not yet, maybe not ever. For 3 days, she became a ghost in her own home, rising before dawn to complete her chores while he was out with the horses, retreating to her room when she heard him return, leaving meals on the table and disappearing before he could thank her. The cabin that had felt comfortable in its smallness now seemed impossibly cramped, every corner holding the possibility of encounter. Dakota didn't pursue her. He left small offerings instead, a handful of piñon nuts on her windowsill, fresh venison wrapped in cloth by the door, water drawn and waiting each morning. He honored her need for distance with the same patience he'd shown from the beginning. On the 4th morning, Maggie found she'd run out of flour, The nearest sack was in the storage room, where she could hear him working on harness repairs. She stood frozen by the empty bin, torn between hunger and cowardice. "The flower's here." His voice came quietly through the doorway. "I'll leave if you need—" "No!" The word escaped before she could stop it. She forced herself to enter the room, though she kept her eyes fixed on the shelves. "I can't avoid you forever." "You could," he said mildly. "The desert teaches patience." She risked a glance at him. He sat cross-legged on the floor, leather and tools spread around him, looking as calm as if the last week hadn't happened. Only a tightness around his eyes betrayed any strain. "Aren't you angry?" she asked. "Why would I be angry?" Because we—" She gestured helplessly. "And then I hid, like a child." He set down the awl he had been working with. "You needed time to think. There is no shame in that." "I've done nothing but think." She sank onto a crate, suddenly exhausted. "I think until my head aches with it." "And what have you concluded?" Maggie laughed bitterly. "That I'm a fool, that I've compromised myself for no reason, that you must think me— I think you are frightened." His voice was gentle but firm. "As am I." That stopped her short. "You're frightened. I've lived alone for 5 years. Maggie, by choice, because alone meant safe. No one to fail. No one to lose." He met her eyes directly. "Then you arrived. And suddenly I remember what it means to want, to hope. Yes, I'm frightened." The honesty in his words made her throat tight. "I don't know how to do this," she whispered. "I don't know how to be whatever we are now." "Nor do I." He returned to his work, giving her space to breathe. "But perhaps we don't need to know. Perhaps we can just be—" She watched his hands work the leather with practiced ease, those same hands that had touched her with such reverence beneath the stars. "The town already whispers about us. If they knew, they whisper regardless. Let them. It's different for you. You're already outside their world. But She stopped, recognizing the lie even as she spoke it. She'd been outside their world the moment Pemberton first cornered her in that supply closet. The moment her baby died, unnamed and unmourned by any but her. "You're right," she said quietly. "I've been outside for a long time. I just pretended otherwise." They worked in companionable silence after that. Maggie fetched her flour, made bread, brought him a portion warm from the oven. Their fingers brushed as he accepted it. And this time, she didn't flinch away. That evening, she joined him for dinner instead of retreating. The conversation was careful, discussing safe topics, the horses, the garden, the need for supplies from town. But beneath the mundane words ran an awareness, electric and undeniable. As she cleared the dishes, Dakota spoke. "I've been thinking about what you need. What would make you feel safer?" She paused, hands in the wash basin. "What do you mean?" "A lock for your door. A separate entrance so you need never pass through the main room. Whatever would help you feel that your choice, to be with me or not, is always yours alone." Maggie turned to face him, soap suds still clinging to her hands. "You would do that? Change your home?" "Our home," he corrected gently. "And yes." Something cracked open in her chest. She dried her hands slowly, choosing her words with care. "What I need, what would make me feel safe, is time. To know you, to know myself with you. Without rushing toward what either of us might think marriage means." He nodded slowly. "The Apache way of courtship can last seasons, until both hearts are certain." "Tell me about it. The Apache way." A small smile touched his lips. "First, there would be gifts, practical things, deer hide for clothing, foods gathered with skill, proof that a man can provide." He gestured to the venison and piñon nuts he'd been leaving. "Though I began that without meaning to." Despite everything, Maggie found herself smiling back. "What else?" "Meetings in public, supervised by relatives, chances to talk, to learn each other's minds without other distractions." His eyes held heat that belied his calm words. "Then, if the woman accepts the suit, negotiations between families. Bride price, Ceremonies. We have no families, Maggie pointed out. No public that would supervise us with anything but scorn. No, we have only ourselves, which means we must be our own guardians, our own witnesses. He stood, moving closer but not touching. I propose this. We court, not as Apache, not as white, but as ourselves. We learn each other in daylight before seeking the stars again. And you keep your door closed until you choose to open it. If you choose. Maggie's heart hammered against her ribs. And if I never choose? Then I will have had the honor of your presence, your friendship. That would be enough. She didn't believe him. The hunger in his eyes was too clear, matching her own. But she believed he would try, would respect her boundaries even if it killed them both. All right, she whispered. We court. The days that followed were sweet torture. They worked side by side, sharing stories of their childhoods. His on the reservation and in the mission school. Hers on a small farm in Ohio before the war. He taught her to read tracks in the dust, to find water by watching birds. She shared her mother's recipes, her father's tall tales, the songs she'd hummed to dying soldiers. Every accidental touch burned. Every shared laugh felt like intimacy. At night, they sat on opposite sides of the fire, the space between them charged with unspoken want. One evening, as she struggled with a torn seam, he offered to help. She watched his hands, so large, yet so precise with the needle, and remembered how they'd felt against her skin. There, he said, handing back the mended shirt. Good as new. Their fingers tangled in the exchange. Neither pulled away. Maggie felt her resolve wavering, drowning in the depth of his eyes. I should check the horses, he said roughly, standing abruptly. She caught his hand. Stay, please, just talk to me. Tell me something. Anything. He sank back down, their hands still linked. What would you know? Tell me about the first time you saw beauty after your sister died, when the world wasn't all darkness. Dakota was quiet so long she thought he wouldn't answer. Then, 3 months after, I was hunting, far from any human place. Came upon a spring I'd never seen before, hidden in a box canyon. The water was so clear you could see every stone at the bottom, and growing beside it, a single columbine, purple as sunset. Ayanna loved columbines. His thumb traced patterns on her palm. I sat there all day, watching the flower move in the breeze, listening to the water, for the first time since finding her. I didn't want to die, just didn't want anything. It was enough to sit and witness beauty still existing. And now? Maggie asked softly. He raised their joined hands, studied them in the firelight. Now I watch seeds you planted push through impossible soil. I see you coax green from the desert, and I think beauty isn't just something we witness. Sometimes we create it, despite everything, because of everything. She couldn't breathe, couldn't think beyond the thunder of her pulse. Dakota! He squeezed her hand once, then let go. Good night, Maggie. But she caught him at the door. Propriety and planning be damned. Pulled his head down and kissed him with all the longing of their careful days. He made a sound like breaking and hauled her against him, returning the kiss with interest. When they parted, both breathing hard, she pressed a finger to his lips before he could speak. I'm still not opening my door tonight, she said firmly, but I wanted you to know, I'm not running anymore. I'm choosing, slowly, but choosing. The smile that spread across his face was answer enough. The stranger arrived with a supply wagon from town, riding alongside old Henrik, who made the monthly deliveries to outlying homesteads. Maggie saw them coming from where she worked in the garden, the dust of their approach visible long before she could make out details. She straightened, wiping dirt from her hands, a prickle of unease running down her spine. Henrik never brought passengers. As they drew closer, she recognized the type, if not the man. Eastern clothes despite the frontier setting, a bearing that spoke of civilization and its assumptions. He was perhaps 40, with graying sideburns and the soft look of a man who'd never known hard labor. Dakota emerged from the stable, moving with that fluid alertness that meant he too sensed something amiss. He positioned himself between Maggie and the approaching wagon, casual but unmistakable. "Mrs. Barrett?" The stranger dismounted before the wagon fully stopped, his eyes fixed on Maggie with an intensity that made her skin crawl. "Mrs. Margaret Barrett, previously Sullivan." The use of her assumed married name, the mention of her past, Maggie's throat constricted. "Who's asking?" "Forgive me." He removed his hat with a flourish that belonged in a drawing room, not a desert homestead. "Mr. Robert Dalton, of St. Louis. I'm here on behalf of your late husband's family." The blood drained from Maggie's face. James had no family. They died in the cholera outbreak of '61. His immediate family. Yes, tragic. Dalton's smile was oil on water. But there are cousins, the Baltimore Sullivans, and they've recently learned of your situation. Henrik, clearly uncomfortable. "Unloaded supplies with unusual haste. I'll be back next month," he muttered, not meeting anyone's eyes as he turned his wagon around. Dalton watched him go with satisfaction before continuing. "Perhaps we might speak privately. Mrs. Sullivan, family matters are delicate." "This is my husband," Maggie said, moving closer to Dakota. "Whatever you have to say can be said freely." Dalton's eyes flicked dismissively over Dakota. "Ah, yes, your arrangement. That's rather what I've come to discuss." He reached into his coat, producing a sheaf of papers. "The Baltimore Sullivans are prepared to offer you a respectable position in their household, companion to elderly Mrs. Sullivan, a chance to return to civilization, to leave this," he gestured at the cabin, "the desert, Dakota. Unfortunate chapter behind. I'm not interested," Maggie said flatly. "You haven't heard the alternative." Dalton's pleasant mask slipped, revealing something harder beneath. "You see, the family has concerns. About the Sullivan name, about what kind of example you're setting. A white woman, living in sin with a savage." Dakota's hand moved to his knife. Dalton stepped back hastily. "Let him speak," Maggie said quietly, though her own hands clenched into fists. "I want to hear it all." Dalton recovered his composure. "The family has resources, connections. There are laws about moral corruption, about unnatural unions, sheriffs who understand the importance of protecting white womanhood, even from itself." He smiled thinly. "But all of that unpleasantness can be avoided. Come with me now. Resume your place in proper society, and the family will ensure your companion faces no legal difficulties. You're threatening him to control me." Maggie's voice was deadly calm. "I'm offering you salvation, Mrs. Sullivan, a return to decency. Surely after what you've endured, widowhood, poverty, the harsh realities that drove you to this desperate choice, surely you welcome the chance to reclaim your dignity." Maggie laughed, a sound sharp as breaking glass. "My dignity? You speak to me of dignity while threatening the man who showed me more honor in 6 months than I knew in all my years of proper society? You're upset. Understandable." Dalton softened his tone to something paternal, condescending. "The frontier does things to women's minds, makes them forget their true nature, their need for protection and guidance. Come home, Mrs. Sullivan. Let your family care for you." "They're not my family," Maggie spat. "And this is my home." Dalton sighed as if dealing with a wayward child. "I'll be staying in Benson for the week, at the hotel. When you've had time to consider, to remember who you truly are beneath this dust and degradation, send word. My offer stands until Friday. After that," he shrugged eloquently. He remounted his hired horse, tipping his hat with mock courtesy. "Good day, Mrs. Sullivan. I trust you'll make the right choice." They watched him ride away, dust settling in his wake like poison. Maggie stood frozen until he disappeared over the ridge. Then her knees buckled. Dakota caught her, guided her to the bench against the cabin wall. "Breathe," he said quietly. "Just breathe." "They found me." "How did they find me?" Her voice cracked. "James spoke of Baltimore cousins once. Said they were vultures who appeared only when they smelled opportunity." "But why now? Why would they care what a poor widow does in the desert?" Dakota was quiet for a moment. Perhaps it's not about you. Perhaps it's about me. An Apache with legal claim to land, with a white wife to legitimize it. There are men who would see that as threat enough to act. The truth of it hit her like cold water. Of course, it wasn't about morality or family honor. It was about land, about preventing an Apache from establishing any foothold in white society. "I won't go," she said fiercely. "Let them threaten. Let them send their sheriffs. I won't." "You should consider it." Maggie jerked away from him, staring. "What?" Dakota's face was stone, but she'd learned to read the pain in his eyes. "He's right about one thing. I've brought you nothing but hardship. In Baltimore, you'd have comfort, safety, respectability. I'd have a cage." She stood, pacing in agitation. "You think I could go back to that life, sitting in parlors, pouring tea, pretending the war never happened, pretending you never happened?" "You could pretend, to survive. It's what we learn, to wear the faces they expect until we almost believe them ourselves." His voice was bitter with experience. "I wore Thomas Barrett for 10 years, and it nearly killed you." She whirled to face him. "Just as pretending to be the proper widow Sullivan was killing me, I won't go back to that living death, not for all the respectability in Baltimore. Even if staying means danger, legal troubles, perhaps violence." He stood, catching her shoulders gently. "Maggie, I've already lost." He stopped, jaw clenching. "You haven't lost me." She gripped his arms, felt the tremor in them. "You won't lose me, not to them. You can't know that. If they bring the law, then we'll face it, together." She pulled his head down, pressed her forehead to his. "I'm not some frightened girl to be cowed by threats. I survived the war. I survived worse than war. I'll survive Robert Dalton and his vulture family." They stood that way, breathing each other's breath, until the sun began its descent toward the mountains. Finally, Dakota pulled back enough to study her face. "You're certain?" "I've never been more certain of anything." She managed a tremulous smile. "Though I could use that lock on my door now, in case Mr. Dalton decides not to wait for Friday." That startled a laugh from him. Short, but genuine. "I'll see to it tonight." They went about the evening routine, caring for animals, preparing dinner, but the shadow of Dalton's visit lingered. Maggie found herself starting at every sound, checking the horizon for riders. Dakota cleaned his rifle with particular care, set it within easy reach. As darkness fell, they sat by the fire as had become their custom. But tonight, Maggie couldn't bear the distance between their chairs. She rose and settled beside him on the floor, her shoulder against his. "Tell me it will be all right," she whispered. He was quiet for a long moment. "I don't know if it will be all right, but I know you are where you choose to be, and I will do whatever necessary to protect that choice." She turned to study his profile in the firelight. "Even if it means letting me go?" "No." The admission seemed pulled from him. "I thought I could, told myself I would, but no, I'm not that noble." He met her eyes. "Does that make me selfish?" "It makes you mine," she said simply. This time when they kissed, there was desperation in it, the taste of possible loss, of time perhaps running out. When they parted, both breathing raggedly, Maggie made a decision. "I'm opening my door tonight," she said against his lips. "Not because of Dalton, not from fear, but because I choose to, because I want whatever time we have to be complete." Dakota pulled back to search her face. "You're certain? There's no rush?" "There's every rush." She stood, pulling him with her. "I've wasted so much time being afraid. No more." At her bedroom door, she paused, suddenly shy despite her bold words. Dakota sensed it, touched her face with infinite gentleness. "We don't have to. I want to," she interrupted. "I want you, all of you, however much time we're given." He kissed her again, slow and deep, then followed her through the door she'd kept closed for so long, in the darkness of her small room, lit only by moonlight through the window. They came together with a tenderness that made her weep. Each touch was a promise, each whispered word a defiance of the world that would tear them apart. Afterward, lying in his arms in the narrow bed, Maggie felt a peace she'd never known. Whatever came with Friday, whatever threats Dalton and his kind might bring, she'd had this moment of choosing love over fear, connection over isolation. "No regrets?" Dakota asked softly, his breath stirring her hair. "None," she said, and meant it. "For the first time in my life, no regrets at all." Outside, coyotes called to each other across the desert, wild and free. Maggie listened to their song and Dakota's heartbeat beneath her ear, and thought perhaps she finally understood what home meant, not a place or a people, but this. Two damaged souls choosing to heal together, despite everything the world threw at them. Friday would come, Dalton would return, the vultures would circle, but tonight, she was exactly where she belonged. The first rocks hit the cabin wall just after midnight. Maggie jolted awake, disoriented in the darkness, Dakota already moving beside her. Another impact, then another, accompanied by drunken shouts. "White whore! Apache lover! Come out and face real men!" Dakota was at the window instantly, rifle in hand. In the moonlight, Maggie could make out 4 riders, maybe 5, circling the cabin like wolves. The smell of whiskey carried even through the closed shutters. "Stay down," Dakota ordered, checking his ammunition. But Maggie was already reaching for her own rifle, the one he'd taught her to use. "Like hell I will." Glass shattered as a larger rock found its mark. Cold night air rushed through the broken pane, carrying with it slurred threats and obscenities that made her stomach turn. "We know you're in there, squaw man. Send out your white woman and we might let you live." Dakota's face was stone in the darkness. He moved to the door, lifted the bar slightly. "I'm coming out. When I do, you bolt the door behind me." "No." Maggie grabbed his arm. "You go out there, they'll kill you. Perhaps. But they might leave once they've murdered you. Then what? You think they'll tip their hats and ride away?" Her grip tightened. "We face this together or not at all." Another window shattered. A torch sailed through, landing on the floor in a scatter of sparks. Maggie lunged for the water bucket while Dakota stamped out the flames. "Burn them out, boys! Cleanse this abomination!" More torches followed. Dakota and Maggie worked frantically, dousing flames before they could catch. Smoke began to fill the cabin despite their efforts. Outside, the riders whooped and hollered, their circle tightening. "The roof," Dakota said grimly. "They'll try the roof next," as if his words summoned it. They heard scrambling above. Someone had dismounted, was climbing. Dakota aimed at the ceiling, tracking the sound, but Maggie caught his arm. "No, we go out, on our terms." She was surprised by her own calm. "They want a spectacle? Let's give them one." Before he could stop her, Maggie threw open the door and stepped onto the porch. Rifle raised, the riders pulled up short, clearly not expecting her to emerge. In the torchlight, she recognized 2 faces from town, men who'd leered at her in the general store, whose wives had crossed streets to avoid her. "There she is." One of them, a thick-set man named Garrett, pointed dramatically. "The fallen woman herself." "Fallen?" Maggie's voice carried clear and cold. "Is that what you call it when a woman chooses her own path? When she refuses to bow to the likes of you? Shameless Jezebel." Another rider, younger, face flushed with drink and righteous fury. "Defiling yourself with that savage." "His name is Dakota." She felt him move beside her, a warm presence at her shoulder. "And he's shown me more humanity than any of you supposed Christians ever have." Garrett spat tobacco juice. "Listen to her, boys. Defending her pet Indian. They've corrupted her mind along with her body. The only corruption here," Maggie said steadily, "is yours. Grown men sneaking around in darkness, threatening a woman because she won't conform to your narrow ideas of propriety. You're no woman." The young one snarled. "You're a—" The crack of Maggie's rifle split the night. The torch in his hand exploded in a shower of sparks. He yelped, falling backward off his horse. "The next one goes in something more vital than a torch," she said calmly, already reloading. I learned to shoot tending wounded soldiers, had to defend the field hospital from raiders more than once. My aim's improved since then. The riders milled uncertainly. They'd expected tears, pleas, perhaps Dakota's violence, not this cold-eyed woman who handled a rifle like she was born to it. You wouldn't dare, Garrett blustered. White woman shooting white men, they'll hang you for sure. Will they? Maggie laughed, sharp as winter. A woman defending her home against night riders, against men who tried to burn her alive. I think any jury might see that differently. Even a frontier jury. Your home. Another man, one she didn't recognize, pushed forward. This ain't your home, woman. This is Apache land, stolen fair and square, and you're helping him keep it. Stolen? Dakota spoke for the first time, his voice carrying quiet authority. I bought this land, paid cash money, have the deed to prove it. Deeds don't mean nothing when they're signed by Apache hands. Garrett sneered. Everyone knows you people can't own property. Ain't natural. What's not natural, Maggie interjected, is grown men so threatened by one woman's choices that they ride out here like cowards in the night. She swept her rifle across their group. Go home. Sleep off your liquor. Let us be. Or what? The young one had remounted, nursing his burned hand. You'll shoot us all? If necessary. Dakota's rifle joined Maggie's, steady and sure. But I think your courage lives in that bottle you're passing around. Come morning, when your head's clear, you'll remember that killing us brings federal marshals, investigation, questions about why 5 men attacked a legal homestead. Legal, Garrett scoffed, but uncertainty flickered in his eyes. My marriage is recorded in Benson. My land ownership, too. You kill us, you're not lynching some nameless Indian. You're murdering Thomas Barrett and his lawful wife. Dakota's smile was cold. The newspapers back east love such stories. White woman killed by mob for marrying outside her race. You'll be famous. Your name's in every paper from here to Boston. The writers exchanged glances. The fun had gone out of it, replaced by the sobering reality of consequences. This ain't over, Garrett finally said. That fancy man from St. Louis, he's got the right idea, one way or another. We'll see you gone from here. Perhaps, Maggie said, but not tonight, and not by your hand. They held their positions, rifles steady as the riders slowly dispersed. Only when the last hoofbeats faded did Maggie lower her weapon. Her hands shook now, adrenaline leaving her weak. Dakota caught her as her knees buckled. You magnificent, foolish woman, he murmured into her hair. What were you thinking? I was thinking, she said against his chest, that I'm tired of being afraid, tired of letting them make me small. She pulled back to look at him. I was thinking that if these are to be our last days, I want to live them standing tall. They spent the rest of the night cleaning glass, patching windows, watching for return visitors who never came. As dawn broke, painting the desert in soft pastels, they stood together surveying the damage. They'll be back, Dakota said quietly. If not them, others like them. This was just the beginning. I know. Maggie leaned into his warmth. Dalton's deadline is tomorrow. When I don't show, we could leave, head deeper into Apache territory. I still have some family who might. He trailed off at her expression. Running means they win. Means every mixed couple after us faces the same hatred with a one less precedent of resistance. She turned to face him fully. I'm not naive. I know we might lose, might die, but I want to make our stand here, on the land you paid for, in the home we've built. Dakota cupped her face in his hands. You humble me, he said simply. They worked through the day reinforcing defenses, boarding windows, checking ammunition, filling every available container with water in case of fire. As evening approached, Maggie found herself oddly calm. I want to tell you, she said as they shared what might be their last peaceful meal, that these months with you have been the happiest of my life. However this ends, I need you to know that. Maggie, no, let me finish. She reached across the table, taking his hands. I came here expecting nothing, a business arrangement with a stranger, Survival at best. Instead, I found—" She struggled for words. "I found myself, who I could be when not crushed by others' expectations. And I found you. Found love I didn't think possible after everything." Dakota lifted their joined hands, kissed her knuckles. In Apache tradition, there's a belief that some souls are split at creation. They spend their lives searching for their missing piece. I stopped believing such things long ago, until you stepped off that train, looking like you wanted to run, but standing firm anyway. I did want to run, she admitted with a watery laugh. Sometimes I still do. But you don't. You stand and fight. You teach me to do the same. His thumbs traced her palms. Whatever comes tomorrow, know that you gave me back my spirit, made me whole. They made love that night with desperate tenderness, memorizing each touch, each whispered endearment. Afterward, they lay entwined, watching stars wheel through the patched window. "If something happens to me," Dakota began, "then I'll keep fighting. For our land. For our right to choose each other." Maggie's voice was fierce. "And if something happens to me, then I'll burn the world down." The matter-of-fact tone made it more chilling than any threat. "But let's plan to survive instead. Together." "Together," she agreed, sealing it with a kiss. Outside, coyotes sang their wild songs. Inside, two souls who'd found each other against all odds held tight, waiting for dawn and whatever judgment it would bring. The world might rage against them, but here in their desert sanctuary, love was its own form of revolution. Friday would come with all its threats and ultimatums, but tonight they were unbroken. Tonight they were free. Friday came with dust on the wind and the distant rumble of approaching horses. Maggie stood at the broken window, watching the riders materialize from the heat shimmer. Not night raiders this time, but an official contingent. Dalton's distinctive figure flanked by what looked like lawmen. "3 of them," she reported. "Plus Dalton." Dakota checked his rifle one final time. "Sheriff Morrison from Tucson. The other is his deputy. Morrison's not a bad man, just weak. Follows whoever pays best." They stepped onto the porch as the riders entered their yard. Sheriff Morrison, a weathered man with tired eyes, touched his hat brim. "Mrs. Barrett, Mr. Barrett." "Sheriff." Maggie kept her voice steady despite her racing heart. "To what do we owe the pleasure?" Morrison shifted uncomfortably in his saddle. "Mr. Dalton here has made some serious allegations. About coercion. Says you're being held against your will." "Do I look coerced?" Maggie gestured to the rifle in her hands. "As you can see, I'm quite capable of defending myself. Now, Margaret." Dalton dismounted, his city clothes already dusty. "There's no need to continue this charade. These men are here to help you, to ensure your safe return to civilization. I am exactly where I choose to be. Mr. Dalton, I told you as much days ago. The frontier does things to women's minds," Dalton addressed the sheriff. "Makes them forget their proper place. Surely you can see she's not thinking clearly, choosing to remain with—" He gestured dismissively at Dakota. The deputy, younger and eager, spoke up. "Ma'am, if you're afraid to speak freely—" "The only thing I'm afraid of," Maggie interrupted, "is men who think they know my mind better than I do." She stepped forward, Dakota a steady presence beside her. "I'm Margaret Barrett. I married this man of my own free will. I live here by choice. Any attempt to remove me against my wishes would be kidnapping." Morrison rubbed his jaw. "Thing is, ma'am, Mr. Dalton's raised questions about the validity of your marriage. Mixed marriages being of questionable legal standing, our marriage was performed by Justice Hammond in Benson," Dakota said calmly. "Recorded in the county register. Unless the law has changed since last month, it stands. Apache can't enter legal contracts," the deputy proclaimed. "Everyone knows that. I'm a landowner," Dakota countered. "Paid taxes last year in this. If I can be taxed, I can marry." Dalton's face flushed. "This is ridiculous. Sheriff, I demand you do your duty. Remove this woman from this unnatural situation." "Can't do that, Mr. Dalton." Morrison sounded almost apologetic. "Not without cause. If she says she's here willingly, then investigate." Dalton pulled out papers. "I have affidavits here. Witnesses who've seen bruises, who've heard her crying. Clear evidence of abuse." Maggie laughed, bitter and sharp. "Bruises from working land. Tears for a dozen reasons that have nothing to do with my husband." She rolled up her sleeves, showing arms marked by sun and labor, but nothing more. "Where are these witnesses? Mr. Dalton, produce them." "They're afraid to come forward. Afraid of what this savage might—" The click of Dakota cocking his rifle silenced him. "Call me that again," he said quietly. "And sheriff or no sheriff, you'll answer for it. Now hold on." Morrison raised a placating hand. "No need for weapons. We're talking civilized here." "Civilized?" Maggie's voice rose. "Like the civilized men who tried to burn our home 3 nights ago? Who threw rocks through our windows, calling me names I won't repeat?" The sheriff's eyes sharpened. "Night riders, you report this?" "To whom?" Dakota asked. "The law that questions my right to exist on my own land? That debates whether my marriage is valid?" Morrison had the grace to look ashamed. "Still, violence is violence. You know who these men were? Does it matter?" Maggie met his gaze steadily. "Would you arrest them? Good white citizens acting on their moral outrage?" Silence stretched taut. Finally. Morrison sighed. "I got no grounds to remove you. Mrs. Barrett, you say you're here by choice. I have to accept that." He turned to Dalton. "Unless you got something more than suspicions and hearsay." Dalton's face purpled. "This is outrageous. I'll wire the territorial governor, the federal marshals. Someone will see justice done." "That's your right," Morrison said tiredly. "But for now, we're done here." He touched his hat to Maggie again. "Ma'am, sorry for the disturbance." As they turned to leave, Dalton wheeled back. "This isn't over. The family has resources, connections, one way or another." "Mr. Dalton." Maggie stepped to the edge of the porch. "Wire James's cousins. Tell them Margaret Sullivan died in Missouri. Tell them whatever you like. But that woman is gone. And she's not coming back. You can't just abandon your race, your heritage. Your duty. Watch me." The finality in her voice seemed to deflate him. He mounted clumsily, city-bred and out of place in the harsh landscape. "You'll regret this. When he shows his true nature. When you're trapped with no escape." "The only trap I was ever in," Maggie said quietly, "was the one your kind built. Good day, Mr. Dalton." They watched the riders disappear into the desert haze. Only when they were gone completely did Maggie allow herself to sag against the porch rail. "It's not over," Dakota said. "He'll make good on his threats. Let him." She turned into his embrace. "Let 'em all come. I'm not hiding anymore." But Dalton's visit had darker consequences than legal threats. Word spread quickly through the territory. The Apache who dared marry a white woman, the woman who'd chosen degradation over respectability. The night riders returned, bolder now. Knowing the law offered little protection, they poisoned the well first. Maggie discovered it when the horse she was watering collapsed, foam on its lips. Dakota put the poor beast out of its misery while Maggie wept angry tears. "We'll haul water from the stream," he said grimly. "It's farther, but clean." Next came the garden. Everything she'd coaxed from the desert soil, trampled, torn up, salted so nothing would grow again. Months of work destroyed in minutes. "We'll replant," Maggie said through gritted teeth, though they both knew it was too late in the season. The livestock began disappearing. A chicken here, a goat there, always the best laying hen, the most productive milker, never enough to justify riding to town to report, even if the law would listen. Through it all, they endured, drew closer, made love with fierce defiance, as if passion could ward off the hate pressing in from all sides. But they were being worn down, and both knew it. The breaking point came on a clear October morning. Maggie was hanging wash when she saw the smoke. Black and ominous. rising from the direction of the stable. "Dakota!" She ran, dropping wet clothes in the dirt. He was already there, throwing open doors, driving panicked horses out. The hay was ablaze, flames licking up support beams. Together they fought it, bucket brigade from the stream. But it was too late. The structure collapsed in a shower of sparks and screaming timber. Dakota stood watching their remaining horses scatter into the desert, his face carved from stone. Without shelter, they won't survive winter. Without horses, we can't work the land or get to town for supplies. We'll build another. With what? The defeat in his voice broke her heart. They've won, Maggie. We can't fight the whole territory. So we leave. Go deeper into Apache lands like you said. Running. He spat the word. Always running. My people from the army. Me from what I've done. Now both of us from small men with smaller minds. Maggie grabbed his soot-stained hands. Not running. Choosing each other over their hate. That night, as they salvaged what they could from the ruins, Dakota told her of a valley he knew, hidden in the mountains, accessible only through a narrow canyon, a place his grandmother had shown him, where his people had sheltered in the bad times. There's water, game, room to build. He stared into the dying embers of their stable. But it's hard living, no town for supplies, no doctor if you fall sick. True isolation. Will we be together? Yes. Then that's all that matters. They prepared through the night, packing only essentials. At dawn, they loaded their few remaining possessions onto a makeshift travois. The cabin looked small and defeated in the morning light. Windows boarded, door standing open like a mouth frozen in surprise. Maggie left a note on the table. To whoever finds this, we lived here, we loved here, we were happy here until hate drove us out. Remember that when you tell stories of the Apache and his white woman, remember we wanted only peace. As they set out, following trails only Dakota knew. Maggie looked back once. Smoke still rose from the stable ruins. Soon, she knew. Scavengers would strip the cabin. Rain would wash away their garden furrows. In a year, maybe two, it would be as if they'd never existed here at all. But they had existed, had carved out a space for love where none should have flourished. That couldn't be erased, no matter how hard the world tried. Regrets? Dakota asked, reading her thoughts. None, she said firmly. We built something beautiful. They destroyed it, but they can't destroy us. The journey to the hidden valley took 3 days through increasingly rough terrain. They climbed switchback trails where one misstep meant death, forded streams running ice cold with mountain melt, slept wrapped together under stars that seemed close enough to touch. On the morning of the 4th day, they emerged from a narrow canyon into a valley that took Maggie's breath away. Meadow grass rippled like a green sea. A creek wound through cottonwoods and willows. Cliffs rose on all sides, protective and isolating in equal measure. Home? Dakota asked tentatively. Maggie surveyed their new kingdom, remote, challenging. But theirs alone. No night riders would find them here, no Daltons or sheriffs or well-meaning saviors. Just the two of them and the wild land that asked nothing but strength and determination. Home, she agreed, and meant it. They set up temporary shelter, planning where their new cabin would rise. As the sun set behind the canyon walls, painting the sky in shades of rose and gold, Maggie felt something she hadn't experienced in months. Hope. They'd been driven from civilization, forced to choose between conformity and exile. They'd chosen each other. And here, in this hidden place, they would build again. Not just a home, but a life free from judgment, where love was its own law and their own truth the only one that mattered. The world had rejected them, so they would create their own world, one day at a time, one season at a time, until even memory of hate faded like smoke on the wind. Winter came hard to the hidden valley. Snow fell for 3 days straight, sealing them in their hastily built shelter, part dugout, part lean-to, barely enough to keep the cold at bay. But they'd prepared well, smoking deer meat, gathering piñon nuts, storing wild roots Dakota knew would sustain them. On the worst nights, When wind howled through the canyon like a living thing, they pressed together under buffalo robes, sharing warmth and stories. Maggie told him about Christmas in Ohio, the smell of pine and cinnamon, her mother's voice singing carols. Dakota shared winter tales his grandmother had whispered, how coyotes stole fire for the people, why the stars formed their patterns. By spring, they'd built a proper cabin, smaller than their old one but stronger, fitted perfectly into the landscape. Maggie started a new garden with seeds she'd saved, coaxing life from soil that had never known cultivation. Their surviving horses, recovered from the desert and brought to the valley, grew sleek on mountain grass. The isolation that might have broken others only drew them closer. They developed their own language of glances and touches, could communicate across the meadow with a gesture. Maggie learned to move silently as Dakota did, to read weather in cloud formations, to find medicine in plants she'd once thought weeds. Summer brought unexpected visitors, a small band of Apache, Dakota's distant relatives who'd heard rumors of his valley refuge. Maggie's heart hammered as they rode in, remembering every newspaper account of Apache raids. But these were families, women with children, elders bent with age, young men wary but not hostile. The leader, a man named Naichi, was Dakota's cousin. He studied Maggie with dark, assessing eyes before speaking in Apache to Dakota. The conversation was long, sometimes heated. Maggie caught her name several times, saw gestures in her direction. Finally, Dakota translated. They're fleeing the reservation. Conditions are bad, no food, corrupt agents, soldiers who abuse their power. They want a shelter here for a time. Of course, Maggie said immediately. There's room. Naichi looked at her directly then and spoke in careful English. You would welcome us, knowing what your people say about mine. My people, Maggie said firmly, tried to burn me alive for loving your cousin. You're welcome here. The Apache stayed through summer into fall. The women taught Maggie their ways of preserving food, tanning hides, weaving baskets so tight they could hold water. She shared her knowledge of herbs, her few precious medical supplies, tended their sick with skills learned in war hospitals. One evening, as the women worked together preparing a communal meal, Naiche's wife placed a hand on Maggie's still flat belly. She said something in Apache, smiling. What did she say? Maggie asked Dakota later. He looked stunned. She says you carry a child, that the women can tell by how you move, how your spirit has changed. Maggie's hand flew to her stomach. She'd suspected but hadn't dared hope. A baby. Our baby. Dakota pulled her close, wonder and fear warring in his expression. A child of two worlds. What life will it have? The life we make for it. Maggie said fiercely. Here, where no one can teach it to hate. The Apache band moved on before winter, seeking their own hidden places, but they left gifts, beautifully beaded clothing, dried foods, a cradle board decorated with protective symbols. Most precious was Naichi's parting words to Dakota, spoken formally before all. Your woman has our people's heart. The child will be welcomed among us. As snow began to fall again, Robert Dalton appeared. He came alone, which should have been their first warning. His fine clothes were travel-worn, his face gaunt with exhaustion or obsession. How he'd found them remained a mystery. Perhaps he'd paid scouts, or followed old Apache trails, or simple malevolent determination had guided him. Maggie was at the creek when she saw him picking his way down the canyon trail. Her blood turned ice cold. She ran for the cabin, for Dakota, for the rifle. But Dalton had learned since their last encounter. He had his pistol drawn when Dakota emerged. Don't, he said, voice cracking with fatigue and something else. Triumph, maybe, or madness. I'm an excellent shot. My father insisted. What do you want? Dakota's voice was steady, but Maggie saw the tension in his shoulders. What I've always wanted, to save Mrs. Sullivan from her degradation. Dalton's eyes found Maggie, took in her obviously pregnant form. His face contorted. My God, it's worse than I thought. You're breeding with it? Leave, Maggie said. Now, while you still can. Dalton laughed, high and unnatural. Leave? I've spent months tracking you. Spent my inheritance hiring guides, buying information. The family cut me off. Said I was obsessed, but I couldn't let it stand. This mockery of everything proper and decent. He swayed slightly, and Maggie realized he was fevered. How long had he been wandering the mountains, driven by his twisted sense of mission? You're ill, she said. Let me help you. Then go. Help? From you? He spat. I'd rather die than accept comfort from a race trader's hands. That can be arranged, Dakota said quietly. No. Maggie stepped between them. No more killing. No more violence. She faced Dalton. You found us, seen us. We're happy, Mr. Dalton, living the life we choose. Why does that threaten you so? Because it's wrong, the words tore from him. Because if women like you can just throw away everything, family, race, duty, then what holds society together? What keeps us from descending into chaos? Love, Maggie said simply. Love holds us together, not your rules or hierarchies or hate. Love. Dalton's gun wavered. For a moment, she thought she'd reached him. Then his face hardened. Pretty words, but blood will tell. That mongrel you carry will grow up torn between worlds, belonging nowhere. You've condemned it to... The shot was impossibly loud in the quiet valley, but it wasn't Dalton's gun that fired. Sheriff Morrison stepped from behind the trees, smoking rifle in hand. Behind him, 2 Apache scouts and a federal marshal emerged. Dalton crumpled, clutching his shoulder where Morrison's bullet had struck. His pistol fell from nerveless fingers. Robert Dalton, the marshal said formally. You're under arrest for assault, attempted murder, and violating the territory's anti-vigilante statutes. How? Maggie breathed. Morrison holstered his weapon. Naichi came to the fort, reported an armed man asking questions about you two, making threats. Figured it was worth investigating. He met Dakota's eyes. Government's trying to improve relations with the Apache. Protecting Apache citizens from vigilante justice seemed a good start. As they bound Dalton's wound and prepared for transport, he raved about purity, about natural order, about the fall of civilization. The marshal shut him up with professional indifference. He'll stand trial in Tucson, Morrison told them. You'll need to testify. We'll be there. Dakota said. Morrison studied them. The pregnant white woman, the Apache man, their hidden valley home. You know there'll be others. Maybe not as crazy as this one, but the hate won't die easy. We know, Maggie said. But we'll be ready. And maybe our child will live to see a different world. The sheriff touched his hat. Maybe so. Mrs. Barrett, maybe so. They watched the lawman take Dalton away, his ravings echoing off canyon walls until distance swallowed them. Then they stood together in their valley, hands intertwined over the life growing between them. The trial in Tucson was brief. Dalton, broken by his obsession and mountain ordeal, was sentenced to 5 years. The newspapers had a field day. Mad gentleman stalks mixed couple to Hidden Valley, but the tone was different now. Some even expressed sympathy for the Barretts, forced from their legal homestead by prejudice. They returned to their valley to await their child's birth. On a clear spring morning, with Dakota's steady hands and ancient knowledge guiding the process, their daughter entered the world. She had her mother's green eyes and her father's dark hair, was perfect in every way that mattered. They named her Rose, for the baby Maggie had lost, and Ayanna, for the sister Dakota couldn't save. Rose Ayanna Barrett, a child of 2 worlds, born free in a hidden valley where love was the only law. As Maggie nursed their daughter while Dakota sang soft Apache lullabies, she thought of all they'd endured to reach this moment, the prejudice that had driven them from civilization, the violence that had tested their bond, the journey that had brought them to this secret paradise. Was it worth it? She asked, though she knew the answer. Dakota kissed her forehead. Then their daughters, every moment, every struggle, to be here, now. With you both? I would walk through fire again. Outside their cabin, the valley bloomed with spring flowers. The creek sang its endless song. And somewhere in the distance, an eagle cried, wild and free, soaring above a world that couldn't cage its spirit. They'd sought mail-order marriage and found profound love. They'd faced hatred and chosen hope. They'd been exiled and discovered home. In the end, that's all any love story is. Two people choosing each other against all odds, building something beautiful in defiance of those who tear it down. Maggie and Dakota had won their right to that choice, paid for it in blood and tears and courage. Now, in their hidden valley with their daughter in their arms, they lived the simple truth they'd fought for. Love is love, no matter what the world says, and love, real love, always finds a way. As the sun set behind canyon walls, painting the sky in shades of rose and gold, Maggie whispered the words she'd wanted to say that rainy night so long ago. Now, you can come in and stay forever. Dakota's smile was answer enough. He was already home. Thank you for joining us on this journey through the untamed heart of the American frontier. If you're listening to this story of love conquering prejudice, we'd love to know where in the world you're tuning in from. Please subscribe to Wild West Campfire and share your thoughts about Maggie and Dakota's story in the comments below. Did their love inspire you? What would you have done in their shoes? Let's keep the campfire conversation burning bright.